Welcome to the Voices of War, a podcast with a simple vision to bring to life the true costs of war through the voices of those who've lived it. I'm your host Maz, and I hope you enjoy this episode. My guest today is Gregg D. Caruso, who's a professor of philosophy at SUNY Corning. He's also a visiting fellow at the New College of Humanities in London, an honorary professor of philosophy at the Macquarie University in Sydney. Gregg is also co-director of the Justice Without Retribution network, housed at the University of Aberdeen School of Law. His research focuses on free will, moral responsibility, punishment, philosophy of law, jurisprudence, social and political philosophy, moral philosophy, philosophy of mind, moral psychology, and neurolaw. He's published numerous books, including Rejecting Retributivism, Free Will, Punishment and Criminal Justice, Just Desserts, Debating Free Will with Daniel Dennett, both books this year's publications, Free Will and Consciousness, A Determinist Account of the Illusion of Free Will, Exploring the Illusion of Free Will and Moral Responsibility, Science and Religion, 5 Questions, and others. He joins me today to talk about free will skepticism, moral responsibility, and our collective views on punishment. Gregg, it's a true pleasure to host you on the Voices of War. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Looking forward to chatting. I
must say, I dare say a lot of my audience might be slightly perplexed by this episode. But I really do think that it's highly relevant to our discussions of conflict, war, and so on, as I hope we'll unpack as we go through. But maybe before we delve into the world of determinism and free will, maybe we can start with hearing a little about your journey into philosophy and particularly the philosophy of free will. How did you come into the field?
Yeah, it's always hard to analyze oneself and figure out how they end up where they do. But I started off as a jazz major pursuing music and thought I was going to be an upright bass player. But I went to a school in New Jersey that was well-renowned for their jazz program, but I just happened to fall in with some philosophy students and started taking some philosophy classes along the way. And by my third year, I had accrued enough credit to essentially get a philosophy degree. So I had this sort of conflict as to which route I was going to go. And a lot of it was just luck, in terms of the people I met. And it turned out that the group I had sort of formed as friends all went on to be professional philosophers. So we started having reading groups and discussions outside of class. And, I always had that interest. I'd always been interested in these sort of big theoretical questions. And I do think there's a connection between the creative part of music and the sort of creative part of philosophy as well. But, and then
how so? That's interesting. That's an interesting point. How so?
Yeah, I think that there's a part of the brain that sort of, especially with jazz, this sort of improvisational ability to sort of to be able to have your ears open, listen what the other people are doing, to sort of improvise as you go, basically composing music on the spot. And philosophers, I think, are really good at being able to learn the skills, especially the conversational skills of being able to listen, the dialectical method of sort of taking things as they come to you, but also sort of responding in various ways and building arguments. Philosophy has a creative and a critical component. When you analyze other arguments, it's this very careful kind of critical dissection. But then there's this creative part, I think, where you build and analyze arguments yourself. And so I just found it very natural for some reason. And then I just decided to follow some of the people ahead of me and ended up going to graduate school. I thought I was going to work in philosophy of mind. That was my initial interest, cognitive science, philosophy of mind. And for many years in graduate school, that's what I focused on. But towards the end, I started to realize that there was a kind of connection between what I was doing in philosophy of mind and these issues about free will. And I've always been interested in the question about free will. So my dissertation was on consciousness and free will. And then that turned into my first book.
Right.
But as I've gotten further along, people started asking me more and more about the practical implications of my view. I'm sure we'll explain that I doubt free will. I deny the existence of free will. And so people started to worry, what does that mean for morality? What does that mean for our criminal justice system? What does that mean for our interpersonal relationships? And I thought maybe I'd do this for a couple of years and move on to some other topics. And yet I've gone down this rabbit hole. So a large part of my career has been focused on cashing out these various consequences of free will skepticism for different domains of our lives, including the criminal law, including criminal justice, public policy, but also how it affects our emotional and interpersonal relationships in terms of attitudes like moral anger and resentment and retributive impulses and punishment and things like that.
I mean, these are all amazingly deep and complex topics, but I think bringing it down to free will, it's such a fundamental question about who we are as individuals, as as a species, and it is also quite a visceral subject. I subscribe to the same line of thinking, and I've just read your book, Just Desserts, and I must admit I sided with you the whole way through. So perhaps I'm slightly biased, but I would consider myself a free will skeptic. A lot of my listeners will know that I'm a long-term meditator, and I think that's something we'll touch on later on about the idea of self. But maybe before we unpack some of the questions that go with it, and maybe even why it's such a touchy subject, maybe you can lay the land for us. What are the kind of principal positions that exist in this debate? Because I think that will give us a nice launching platform to then delve deeper into some of these questions.
Yeah, sure. I'll try not to overwhelm people with terminology because it could get quite complicated quickly. But there are different possible ways that one could question or notions that could threaten the existence of free will. First, let me define what I mean by free will. So for me, free will is the kind of control and action that agents would have in a way that would make them morally responsible for their actions. So I keep free will and moral responsibility closely tied. In fact, I define free will in terms of the control and action that would make agents morally responsible in the way that we could be justified in blaming them for their actions, holding them morally responsible in a very specific sense, what I call a basic desert sense, but basically that they would be truly deserving of things like blame and praise and punishment and reward.
Yeah, so just to put that into context, so somebody does, as a very banal example, somebody does exceptionally well in an exam. We have this, the natural inclination for us is to say, hey, well done, congratulations, you've really worked hard, you deserve to get those marks. Conversely, someone who flunks it and fails, well, it's obvious. I could have told you were going to fail because you didn't study. It's your fault, et cetera, et cetera. Right. That's the two basic, as what we talk about, or how you define a free will. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So, the title of the book with Dennett is Just Desserts, and so I kind of underestimated people's familiarity with that phrase, but people thinking deserts or what we have after dinner. But just desserts is sort of the punishment that one deserves or the praise that one deserves. And so usually it's the idea that the person was free and morally responsible when they engaged in some wrongdoing, so they deserve to be punished or blamed.
Yeah, because they could have done otherwise. They could have done otherwise, right?
Yeah, could have done otherwise. Also, sometimes the idea is that, well, since the agent is the source of their actions, and it's a reflection of their true self, that they deserve some sort of reaction. So historically, there have been a number of threats to this idea. I won't go through one of them, but theologically, there was the concern of God's foreknowledge. If he knows everything that's going to happen, how can agents be free and morally responsible? The more scientific concern arose with Newtonian physics and the development of modern physics with the idea of determinism. And so determinism is sort of the thesis that facts about the remote past, in combination with the laws of nature, entail there's only one fixed future. So what happens is the only thing that could have happened. So you're boiling the water. The idea is that if you knew all the laws of nature and all the antecedent conditions, the metal content of the kettle, the amount of heat that's being applied. The water is determined to boil, and not only determined to boil, but determined to boil at precisely the moment it boiled. It couldn't have boiled at any other moment. And the fear was that if determinism is true, how could agents be free and morally responsible? And so 3 views have sort of emerged. One view was called hard determinism, which sort of says determinism is true. Everything that happens is causally determined to happen. And because of that, agents are not free and morally responsible. And the argument was largely that determinism rules out free will because it rules out, as you said, either the ability to do otherwise, you couldn't have done anything different than what you did, or it rules out the possibility that the agent was the ultimate source of their actions, because the source of their actions drain back to factors,
to some causes, upstream causes,
like upbringing, brain chemistry, how they were raised, the circumstances,
the weather, whether they slept, had they had their coffee, all of these conditional factors that have brought us to the now, which basically, and if I understand it correctly, and sorry to interrupt you, just so I can contextualize it, but so I don't miss the point. In a perfectly deterministic world, if I had the ability to calculate all the forces at play, I could tell the future. That's if I had the theoretically, if I had the ability to calculate all the forces acting upon me, I could predict exactly what I'm going to say 3 minutes from now. That would be okay.
And in reality, unfortunately, the factors are too broad and too diverse,
and it could never really happen.
Then there was a view called libertarianism, not to be confused with the political view, but this is a sort of metaphysical view about free will. And I think this idea actually came before the political view. But it's the idea that, if determinism is true, we also lack free will. But this view rejects determinism and tries to preserve some sort of what you might call indeterminate free will. And so there are different ways libertarians try to do this. Nowadays, some of them will point to quantum mechanics as evidence that maybe there's some fundamental indeterminacy at the lowest level of the universe, and that somehow it could rise up or percolate up to the level of human agency.
Right. So a randomness, I'd imagine. So it's the now interplaying with everything that's come beforehand to now.
The things could have different types of outcomes could follow.
Okay, interplaying with some random events.
Keeping everything exactly the same. Although some libertarians introduce other notions, like notions of the self, that are quite mysterious, where the agent could somehow cause their own actions but not be caused by anything. Or some people posit even notions of substances, selves that are different than their physical brains and their physical makeup. And then there's one last view called compatibilism, that is the view that Dennett defends in the book. And this is a view that says, you can accept determinism and still hold agents free and morally responsible, because what's really required for free will is not the falsity of determinism, but that agents are causes of their actions in some appropriate way, that they're free from coercion, from external agents coercing them. They're free from any sort of internal coercion due to, say, like a mental disability. But as long as agents act voluntarily, as long as they act on their own reasons or something, as long as they approve of their own motivational states, then they're free, and we can hold them responsible. Let me just say that my own view is sort of neutral on determinism. So I'm a kind of modern free will skeptic, and my view is sort of like, it doesn't matter whether determinism is true or indeterminism is true. We would lack free will either way.
Regardless,
that determinism is incompatible with free will, but so too is indeterminism. Because agents would be no more in control of indeterminate events than they'd be in control of determinate events. And so the kind of indeterminacy that the most plausible kinds of accounts of free will would posit, I don't think are able to preserve the control required for agents to be, free and more responsible in this sense.
As in, I can't control randomness. So even though it might be indeterminate in the libertarian sense, for me as the agent, I still have zero. There is no free will there. because I don't control in any way do I decide what randomly may or may not occur.
That's true, yeah. And that would be the concern with, at least one kind of libertarianism. The other kind of libertarianism, I would just say, doesn't fit with our best scientific theories about the world. Right. It runs into other sort of problems, and not to bog things down, but I reject that notion too. And so in the end, I sort of say there's problems with all these different ways of trying to preserve free will. And as a result, the only rational position left to adopt is skepticism. And so skeptics either doubt or deny the existence of free will. I'm more of a sort of global skeptic who sort of says that who we are and what we do is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control, whether those be determinism, indeterminacy, or luck, which I might mention now in a moment. Yeah. And because of that, we're never morally responsible in this relevant sense. Let me just throw in there, because I mentioned luck. Your listeners already might be like, oh my God, that's a lot of information. You can almost forget some of the issues about determinism and indeterminism. Another sort of independent concern people have is simply a problem, the problem of luck. And so another argument I sort of present two distinct arguments against free will, but the luck argument is follows a philosopher named Neil Levy, who actually lives in Australia, at least half of the year. And so was the other half at Oxford.
Yeah, half is luck.
Yeah. And so the idea is that our actions would be the result of either two types of luck. So there's what's called constitutive luck, which is the kind of luck that makes you the person you are. Constitutive luck is the kind of luck that shapes you as an agent, your psychological states, your predispositions, your likes and dislikes. And constitutive luck could be a byproduct of, who you were born to, who your parents were, what society you were raised in.
Genetics.
Whether you were rich or poor, right? Genetics. All these factors that you ultimately have no control over, right?
Yeah.
And then there's what's called present luck, which is luck around the time of action. And that could be the luck of what thoughts come to me in that particular moment, whether my mind wanders or doesn't wander, what reasons become most salient, or what reasons weigh most heavily when I'm making a choice or deliberating. Whether the color of the wall could somehow be affecting me in a way that I'm unaware of, or whether situational factors could be influencing me in ways that I'm not aware of. And that would be present luck. And then the argument is that constitutive luck and present luck swallow all. That our actions are the result of either constitutive luck, present luck, or both. And luck undermines free will and moral responsibility because, again, it's the result of factors beyond the control of the agent.
Yeah.
And so whether the threat is determinism, that everything that happens is determined by antecedent conditions and the laws of nature, or whether the threat is luck, I argue that we have good reason for denying that agents are free and morally responsible in this fundamental sense.
Yeah. Again, I've been nodding along as you were saying, because that speaks a lot to me in the way I've come to think about things. I think I was first introduced to this kind of idea of the environment having an impact. I think it was Kurt Lewin. The behavior is a function of the environment and the personality. So it's an interplay of the person and the environment. That's what's going to determine behavior. And I think that for most people, that's something that's quite acceptable. Most of us, when we start having these discussions, we can comfortably agree that, of course, the environment has an impact. If I haven't slept for 48 hours, I'm basically legally drunk. And everybody who hasn't slept the night knows what that feels like, and therefore
it could affect your deliberations, your choices, your actions,
everything, right? So it's just and I think the sensitivity is at the point of now. This is where which is why I think Dennett's position is probably the most palatable to people, because it's the one that allows you to kind of, I don't want to say sit on the fence, because he doesn't sit on the fence. He's quite precise about what he means. But it allows you to accept determinism up to now, that everything that I am right now is because of everything that's happened before. And we can all trace our lineage and our lives back to why we are the way we are. If this is why we go to psychologists, right? To explore how our childhood has impacted the person we are now.
Yeah, exactly.
But people are very sensitive to this idea of, well, hold on, but the future, I have I have the power to decide. I have free will. Why do you think we are so? And I've literally seen visceral reactions when I've had these debates with people where, I've in some way would try to walk them down the path of trying to agree with me that really, free will is an illusion, if that. And there's oftentimes a visceral response and a physical response as though I've somehow threatened them. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think people, well, there's a couple of reasons, I think. I mean, people fear the implications of this, and I think it's partly due to, in my view, a misunderstanding of what the implications would be. But people think it would lead to nihilism or despair, or we were just like criminals when free. Dan Dennett in the book sort of repeatedly, to my annoyance, repeatedly sort of says, well, we end up in a Hoppian state of nature where life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. My experience has been people don't reject free will skepticism as much based on the arguments. They see the arguments, as you say. They reject it more based on the consequence. They just don't like the consequences of the view, and so sort of instinctively sort of want to reject it. The other thing I think that plays a big role is phenomenology, which is the way we experience our own actions. People just don't feel like they're determined. They don't feel like their actions are the result of factors beyond their control. So there's a kind of I think it's a poor kind of inference, but it's sort of like I feel myself free, therefore I am free. And so they sort of say, well, look, how could you deny how I experience my own actions in this way? But I've argued in the past that phenomenology is misleading and that we could explain why we feel that way, despite the fact it's an illusion. But I do think that plays a role. I think the two things that really play the biggest role is how we experience our own actions and the fear that we need more responsibility for civil society to somehow function properly. Now, I've tried to argue against both of those views, saying not only can we live without the belief in free will, that it would be beneficial. So I actually consider myself what's called an optimistic skeptic. I'm optimistic about the implications of free will skepticism on our lives. And I argue that the living without the beliefs in free will and moral responsibility, in particular, just deserts, getting rid of the notion of just deserts, and with the notion of retribution, we would actually be better off, and that we could adopt perhaps even more humane and effective practices and policies if we begin to view people as embedded in social systems, as affected by social constructs and social conditioning and socialization. That once we begin to realize that give up this belief in free will and just deserts, we can look more deeply into the causes that shape individuals and their behaviors. And I think this can lead to more effective and humane practices and policies. So.
And again, I couldn't agree more, because I think, again, as I made the point, we go to psychologists to try and resolve our issues. By doing that very thing. Yet when we, at a micro level, but when we try to apply that at a macro level, we seem to be somehow resistant that, hold on, even society functions in this way. And if we set up, we know through decades and decades of research that, where you're born, what socioeconomic class you're born, we know that that's going to have a particular, that it's going to, it might not determine it from birth, but it will increase the probability of certain outcomes in your life. Whether you're born in poverty, you'll end up in poverty. Yeah. Sorry.
One of the things I do in my other new book, Rejecting Retributivism, is I sort of I lay out my arguments for free will. I lay out an alternative approach of criminal justice, but there's a whole chapter on what I call the social determinants of criminal behavior, the social determinants of violence. And what I try to argue is that, and this is well supported by a wealth of data. I cite, hundreds to thousands of studies in this chapter that seem to indicate that the social determinants of violence are very similar to the social determinants of health. So things like poverty, low socioeconomic status, things like poor nutrition, things like environmental health, mental health, homelessness, All of these are factors of abuse, being exposed to violence yourself. There's a wealth of social determinants. And we know intuitively, for example, that these affect health outcomes. So we know people who are born into low socioeconomic groups or into poverty have higher rates of type 2 diabetes, higher rates of morbidity, higher rates of heart disease. But there's no greater correlate with incarceration rates than socioeconomic status. So we know that if you're born into poverty, that this is going to negatively affect one's life outcomes and could potentially have, ramifications. Now, it's not the only determinant. There's all kinds of other factors. But we know that when we look at things like, just one example, if you look at women who are incarcerated, there was a study that found that 85 to 90% of them had been victims of violence before their incarceration. That is, they've been either have experienced domestic violence, rape, sexual assault, child abuse, some sort of violence. And we have this idea of black and white, sort of good and bad. The cowboy in the white hat is the good guy, and the person in the black hat is the bad guy, and the criminal is the perpetrator, and the victim is has been the victimized. But the line is not that clear. When you look at the lives of those who are incarcerated, what you often find is that they live lives of hardship, and that almost all of them, the vast majority of them, have been victims themselves in the past. And so 85 to 90% of incarcerated women have been abused. And that abuse has affected them psychologically, and that psychological effect has had a big impact on their lives. Now, there are multiple reasons that you might engage in criminal acts, but one of these is, they might engage in a criminal act against their abuser. Most of these are in co-addictive relationships. So there's violence, but there's also a co-addiction. And so they might end up being addicted, resorting to petty crimes to get by, but often they're the ones that are forced to commit the petty crimes. And the other big cause is essentially that domestic violence or rape or sexual assault has a psychological effect on women, and unemployment rates are higher. So they're suffering from essentially, post-traumatic stress disorder and other kinds of psychological effects of the abuse. They can't hold steady jobs. And because they can't hold steady jobs, their incomes are negatively affected, which causes them to resort to petty crimes to get by. If you want to prevent criminal behavior, if you want to effectively prevent violence, the best way to do it is to address the social determinants of the actions, to address the systemic causes. And the same is true across the board. Like, for example, there's a study done on men that committed violent acts in a prison in Boston. And what they found was 50% of them had been beaten as children. And 40% had seen someone killed in front of them. Just think about that. 40% of those people incarcerated committing violent crimes have themselves seen someone killed. And that's because if you grow up in a community of violence, if you grow up in an inner city where there's gang violence all around you all the time, that's going to have an effect on your life. And we also know that high stress environments have an effect on people.
Well, they rewire the brain, right?
Yeah, it has a direct effect on brain development. The gray matter of the brain is thinner in people who grow up in poverty than people who grow up in wealth. And we know that the neurological development is affected by the circumstances. The neurological development affects behavioral development and moral development, which affects their outcomes, their behaviors. And so the more and more we learn about how these social determinants affect outcomes, the more I think we should begin to view individuals more holistically and see them as embedded in these systems. And it also should tell us that one of the things we need to do to successfully prevent these poor outcomes is to shift the focus to prevention and social justice, to addressing the systemic inequalities that cause these outcomes in the first place.
I mean, the way I see it, the way I explain it in my mind is, we go through life, and every interaction with every person, every circumstance, every moment, we hit some sort of a bumper. And that bumper, it's almost like a never-ending pinball machine, right? And I'm the ball that's hitting various bumpers as I'm going along. And every bumper is a person or a circumstance. And that changes me in whatever minute way or major way. Something might change me significantly and dramatically. And what for somebody born into, abject poverty, while it's easy for us to sit on our high horse and say they have the chances, if they really wanted to, they could. And also because we use that, small percentage of people to manage to get out, to escape the trap. Well, look, they could do it. Right? Yeah. But then when we explore we peel it back and you realize, well, hold on a minute, they managed to hit different bumpers. There were different people along the way that bumped them in a different direction.
Exactly. It's a matter of luck, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It could be a matter of meeting a supportive teacher who introduces them to a hobby that turns into their passion.
Someone who helps you fill out a scholarship application or like whatever, just pure.
Or the luck of just meeting a friend who diverts them in a different direction. And so it seems, and it's sad, but it seems like, this, especially in the United States, we have this idea of the causa sui, the person who could lift themselves up from the bootstraps and overcome all their circumstances, that they're purely self-made. Yeah. And it's really built into the mythology of America, this mythology of meritocracy and the American dream. But it's also wrapped up in the idea, and it's very much associated with the political right in the United States. This idea that, well, because I'm purely self-made, I deserve all the praise for my accomplishments. But equally, those that fail are somehow deserving of condemnation. That if you're in poverty, it's due to your lack of effort. It's due to your laziness. It's due to your own free will. And this mythology has reigned for a long time. In fact, I get Daniel Dennett to agree to a quote by Ronald Reagan in the book, which was interesting, which is a quote that I think Ronald Reagan made way before he was president. But it was something like, we shouldn't, every time we have to get beyond the idea that every time a crime is committed, that it's society's fault, and we have to return to the notion of individual responsibility. Of course, Ronald Reagan was also one of the main drivers of mass incarceration in the United States. And so the idea is that, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you view everything through the lens of individual responsibility, everything, the right response to wrongdoing is punitive. It's punish. Yeah. But to punish the woman who's already been victimized, right, for now having the negative effects of that victimization seems like double jeopardy, right? You got screwed in the initial lottery, and now you're being penalized the second time for having, not overcome those poor effects on you. Now, I have an argument for, we're not going to just let people run free. We're not going to just let, violent criminals walk the streets, but we have to view them differently than this kind of purely reactive approach that's based in the idea that all wrongdoing and all moral behavior, right, deserves praise and deserves the rewards. And the same thing is, economic policy in the United States is largely based upon this kind of mythology as well, right? To reward those who succeed. Well, those who succeed often have, a number of advantages and matters of luck that give them these advantages. And there aren't sort of, equal starting points for all people. And there are more hurdles that have to be overcome by people who have disadvantages and certain kinds of, poor outcomes due to luck. Again, nothing that's due to their own circumstances.
And I think this is the difficult thing for people to because like you said, meritocracy is so deeply embedded in certainly in Australia, the Australian dream. I mean, if you work hard, you'll make it. But I read recently, Michael Sandel's, The Tyranny of Merit. Fantastic book because it just peels back everything you've just said particularly in the US. About the success rates and how many generations it takes in the, land of the free, home of the brave, how many generations it takes, I think he says 6 generations on average to get from the bottom, I'll forget the figures, won't be accurate, I think, but kind of the bottom 10% to the top 10%, something like that. It takes 6 generations, which is not part of the American dream. That is not, the American dream is that you can be a migrant and work hard and, within your own lifetime, you can go from rags to riches. And that's very much, I think that's broadly speaking, that's also the Australian dream in many ways. It's the, the house with white picket fence and 2.2 children. That's everybody can have that dream. But I think maybe not taking it away, but threatening that through this idea that free will doesn't exist. In other words, that, well, hold on. If what I've earned is not my own doing. I think that puts that's a significant pressure on one's identity, because we identify with our professional achievements, we identify with who we are, with our peer groups, our social standing, and that's part of the idea of success. Is that you need to climb the social hierarchy. Yeah, sorry.
Let me say something. So I want to make sure that people don't misunderstand the skeptical view, because although I deny that agents are basically morally responsible in this basic sense. There are other notions of responsibility, I think, that remain in place. So one of them, in philosophical terms, is called attributability, or attributable responsibility. And that means you could attribute various accomplishments to individuals. You could attribute various personality traits and various achievements. I don't deny those, right? So for example, there's a great example. I don't know if I use it in that book or elsewhere, but there's a quote I use from Albert Einstein. He was interviewed in a newspaper, and he was a free will skeptic. He was a determinist, and he denied free will. And they asked him about his accomplishments of general relativity and his scientific theories. And he says he deserves no praise for them, which is a kind of radical idea, right? But he acknowledges that, who he is and the byproduct of his achievements are due to factors ultimately beyond his control. Now, I think you could say that, but you could also attribute to Einstein creativity. You could attribute to Einstein originality in his thought. And you could do that by basically relational kinds of assessments of his peers, right? You could say that compared to other physicists, he was more original. You could say like Miles Davis was more original than maybe other trumpet players were at the time. You could attribute creativity. You could attribute personality traits like his work ethic and his stick-to-itiveness or whatever virtue he had. You could say they belong to him. You could say all of that without saying that he self-made them, and that he somehow deserves praise for them. So the idea is that we could still say that these achievements are yours; they belong to you as a person, and we could attribute various traits to individuals. We could also say that individuals are causally responsible for various outcomes. We could say all of that again without thinking that they were self-made and that they are deserving of ultimate, basic. Deserve for those traits, both when those traits are good and when they're bad. And Einstein was able to see that. It's a very hard thing for people to see. People see it sometimes, though. For example, when one turns out well as a moral person, sometimes upon reflection, people could see and say, you even hear them say things like, well, that was because, thanks to mom and dad. Or, I was raised well. That might even be a common retort someone says when you say, oh, you're such a good person. And you could say, well, thank my parents for that. And that's a kind of acknowledgement that my moral character was shaped by how I was raised and the kind of moral education and moral direction that was given to me by these outside forces, particularly your family and your parents. And that's a kind of acknowledgement that sometimes we could see. But then we tend to want to forget it when it comes to other types of achievements, other types of character traits. But when you really reflect upon those character traits, like I used to like, weird examples, but, I use this kind of example with my students. I say, I'm not wearing a black shirt today, but I tend to wear a lot of black shirts. And so one day a student asked me, like, why do you always wear black shirts? And I was like, that's a great question. Let's think about this. And so let's say I'm in the store. Right? I wore a black shirt because my closet is full of black shirts. But let's go back to when I purchased the black shirt. And I'm standing there in the dressing room. And my wife might hand me a yellow shirt. She said, like, you really need to diversify your wardrobe. So let's take that moment when I put the shirt on and I look in the mirror, okay? Well, I'm looking in the mirror and I put on the yellow shirt and I react. Now, we don't control that reaction. We have no ultimate control over our likes and dislikes. We are reacting to our likes and dislikes and our preferences. And then I put on the black shirt. I'm like, oh, that's cool. I'm going to buy the black shirt. Now, I'm making my choice based on my habitual likes and dislikes. But my habitual likes and dislikes have been shaped by factors that go back my whole life. How I was raised, also the climate in which I'm raised. If I was raised in Hawaii where it was sunny all the time, maybe I wouldn't like black. Some of it might have to do to my personality. Some of it might have to do with I grew up in New York City and came to maturity in New York City. And so the fashion sense and the peer influence of other people, those kind of things all influence your likes and your dislikes.
Yeah.
But if you don't control your likes and your dislikes, if you don't control your reactions, and your choices are a byproduct of those likes and dislikes and reactions, then you're not ultimately controlling the choice.
Yeah. It might feel voluntary, right? And that's what we can also ascribe to a voluntary action, because yes, it feels like I'm making a decision, but when you really pull it back,
it's a decision that ultimately is beyond my control. Yeah. It's like my wife doesn't like mushrooms, and I just say like mushrooms. That pisses her off more, because you can't just flip a switch and like something that you're habitually, or maybe it's a texture issue or something. And so you can recondition yourself, but the causes for those reconditioning would itself be the byproduct of factors beyond my control.
What drove you to do it? Exactly. Yeah. Well, yeah.
Like say I eat chocolate all the time, and I believe there's chocolate in the kitchen, and I desire chocolate, and so I always seem to be eating the chocolate. And one day I go join Chocoholics Anonymous to try to get control of my chocolate cravings. The question would be, what would be the cause of the desire to stop desiring chocolate?
Yes. Yeah.
Where did that come from? And that itself would be causally determined by factors beyond my control. It might be my wife commenting about my weight. It might be my doctor mentioning my high cholesterol. It might be something I read in a newspaper. But something shifted the scales that my desire for chocolate weakened. Or if it didn't weaken, my desire to stop eating chocolate got stronger. And now I make different choices, and then I take steps to recondition myself or help myself behaviorally overcome it. But that's not the overcoming of free will. That's just a new, like you put it, I hit a few different bumpers, and those bumpers redirected my beliefs and my desires and shifted my psychological weights such that my actions drove me in a different direction. So people tend to point to those as examples of free will, but those are just further examples about how our actions are shaped by conditions beyond our control.
Absolutely. That's such a example. That's a great example. I mean, I used to be a heavy smoker many years ago, and I knew smoking's bad. I knew it. They couldn't deny it. But, I also wanted to keep smoking. So there was this cognitive dissonance. And we know that when there's a cognitive dissonance, we will try to suppress one of those. And probably subconsciously or whatever, I suppressed the knowledge that smoking is bad until such time that bumper kept getting hit until such time where I realized, hold on a minute, I'm struggling to walk up a set of stairs, and this is having a serious impact on my life. So there's a bunch of things that have driven my ultimate behavior to quit smoking for good. But I can easily say, it was strength of character, it was my free will. Well, I don't think so. It was just that life has led me to the point where, okay, now I've hit enough bumpers to push me in this direction. But this takes me to another important point, and one that I think is perhaps where this kind of zeroes in at the moment of now. And this is the idea of thought or the self. Because this is one, and this is maybe where my meditative practice or deep practice has made me realize how reliant we are on this idea of the self in the mind, and I often, when I speak about this to people, I say, okay, how about for 1 minute, stop thinking for 1 minute. If you have free will, if you are in control of the mind or the self, just stop thinking for 1 minute. That's all. It's of course not going to happen because a chattering mind will awaken in a matter of seconds if you're lucky. So what's your thought? How do you define, firstly, the mind, especially since you've done so much work on the theory of your mind, but then the self as well, because those two are so closely intertwined?
Yeah, I mean, in going back to sort of the phenomenology of free will, the feeling we have this feeling of a self that sort of stands behind our actions and is the cause of our own actions. But there are various ways that we could see that's kind of an illusion. And so there's the sort of personal experiential route, which you and Sam Harris and probably others have gone through meditation and sort of seeing through and diminishing the ego and the self. The other is a sort of cognitive science, what it tells us about the mind and how the mind works. And so a lot of times what I like to see is that there is no robust self, and there is really no unified self. that stands behind our actions and is sort of like the causes the uncaused cause of what we do. And a good way to kind of get at it is also look at how the notion of the self and experience of the self can break down in various disorders. And so there's all kinds of different ways our sense of self can go wrong. There's what I might call the sense of ownership. Mm-hmm. I have ownership over my actions, and they belong to me. And then there's a sense of authorship. I author these actions, I author these thoughts, and I control my movements and my limbs. There are disorders where each of those can go awry and they could go wrong. And they help show us how fragile the notion of the self is. So, for example, thought insertion, schizophrenic thought insertion. Now, not all people with schizophrenia have this experience, but there are people who actually feel like the thoughts that are in their head, the thoughts that are going through their stream of consciousness, do not belong to them. They're friends' thoughts. Now, that's a sense of where ownership goes wrong. They're thoughts in my consciousness, in my mind, in my stream, but they don't belong to me. I don't own them in any way. And when that happens, people don't feel agency over those thoughts. And the same happens when there's a breakdown in the sense of authorship. So you may have seen, and many people have seen, Dr. Strangelove, the classic movie where the guy can't control his limb. And so there's like trying to strangle himself. There are people with what's called anarchic hand syndrome who basically have a limb that acts according to its own volitions, as they describe it, and they don't feel any authorship over it. They know it's their limb. They know it's on their body. It belongs to them. So they feel ownership, but no authorship. And so there's all kinds of these ways where the self could easily sort of fall apart. And by looking at those, you could start to reconstruct, well, why do we have this sense of self? And in my first book, I sort of give an account based on cognitive science and based on a particular theory of consciousness that I tend to lean towards, called the higher order thought theory. I won't get into the details, but there are various ways you can account for how that self gets created over time. But it's such a fragile thing. And there's no unity to it. Like David Hume had this very famous, in fact, maybe Hume is a sort of precursor of this Buddhist idea. He says, every time I reflect upon my actions, every time I reflect on this inner stream of consciousness, I never perceive a self. I only perceive a particular belief or a particular desire or a particular willing. I only perceive particulars. No self, no robust thing that you would call or associate with the self. And I think that there's a sort of, it just gets built up over time that we collect all of these unified individual events and ascribe them to a consistent self. And then we start to see that self as the agent for our actions. But there are various ways that could just go awry. It could go awry and it could break down. And it shows you just how fleeting and how, how tendential that feeling of self is. And how lucky in a way we are that we experience it. I'm not saying, that it'd be better off without it. There's very important evolutionary reasons why we probably have this sense of self. But it's kind of unique. And one thing that always sort of struck me is that we feel agency over certain types of mental events, but not others. So we feel agency and free will over sometimes our thoughts or sometimes our actions, but we don't have the same feeling about what I would call sensory states. When I look out my window and I see the tree in the backyard, I don't feel like I had any free will over that perception. It's a combination of my functioning vision and a tree causes in me the perception of a tree. I didn't freely bring it about. And we have that feeling about most sensory experiences, the pain, the mosquito bite. I didn't freely cause those things. They are my perception of what's happening to me. But we don't feel that way, or we feel more, I think, agency over my political belief. Or over my musical tastes, my desires for certain artists, or my desire for black, or my preference for black.
Yeah.
I feel like I choose that. I control that. But my argument would be that both of them are the byproduct of causes, and both of them are a byproduct of factors that are triggering various things. And but we experience them differently because the way we represent them to ourselves. We represent sensory states as caused by some external thing. And it's usually because it's present.
Yeah.
When I experience a tree, other than illusions, it's because there's a tree there, and it's the cause of my perception of a tree. And so I attribute that.
You can attribute it easily. Yeah.
We can't necessarily easily see the causes of our beliefs, our desires, our preferences. And they're usually just diffused. They're not just one cause. The cause for my political belief, for example, is not going to be one singular event. It's going to be a host of different events. Yeah. And so it's harder for us to identify them. We don't represent them to ourselves in the same way. Yeah. And evolutionarily speaking, it would require too much cognitive energy to represent those states along with their causes. There'd be no benefit. But there is a benefit, evolutionarily speaking, to represent not only the pain, but the cause of the pain. Because, well, I want to make sure I remove myself from the circumstances that are causing the pain. So there's an evolutionary benefit that we evolve so that we represent certain states along with their causes, but we don't do so for others.
For others, yeah, and for some are simpler because they're so self-evident almost. You know, there's a lion. Well, you know, I don't need to think about this much. I know exactly where this is going to go. But for my thoughts or my thinking patterns or, you know, even my choices, quote unquote, you know, if we had various dials for all the various forces that might impact, you know, have impact in literal life, you know, it's just a matter of turning these dials ever so minutely differently for different people as they inevitably would have, you know, through the different bumpers that we've hit in our lives. But to calculate that will just, well, in fact, it's impossible because you can never really know all the forces that were at play, that it's turned my dials one way or another, which I think, again, it brings us down to the absolute inevitability of, you know, that, you know, things have caused what I am now, and things going forward, you know, will also be caused by what's happening around me now. I'm conscious of our time, and this is such a fascinating discussion. I think we could spend days talking about this, but I do want to maybe pivot to what this podcast is ultimately about, and that is war and conflict, and maybe launch us into some slightly murkier waters, maybe, because I want to see how this, and then lead us down to the idea of and to your quarantining model. But certainly, I want to try and figure out how this applies to geopolitics as one, right? Because it applies at a micro level, but it applies at a society level, and of course at the global level, an interplay between nations. Because if free will is not a thing, then it's not a thing for civilization, for geopolitics, for relationships between China, US, for every war that we've had. There are causes upstream that have led us to that, to every interaction that exists. How do you view that kind of maybe bigger macro level picture?
Yeah, it's complicated, and so it depends on how we're going to link up these kind of issues with public policy. But I think the connection is most apparent for me in terms of moral responsibility in say conditions of conflict. So one area, and this is not my area of specialty, but one area that I have thought about a little bit is sometimes what's called transitional justice, the kind of processes that occur, let's say, after a genocide. And we have to go back and figure out how best to proceed. Or in South Africa, the most classic case is after apartheid, the process of reconciliation. And so one way you can go is you go back and you try to hold everyone accountable. You go back and you hold everyone responsible for their individual actions. That's one process, and that's retributive. And that might be that we go back and we want to give all of those people their just desserts by punishing all the war criminals and punishing all the individual actors who committed wrongdoing during this kind of war or conflict or genocide. The other approach is what they employed sort of in South Africa, which was you can, and I think this is more consistent with free will skepticism. is that you could first engage in a kind of fact-finding mission. There's nothing in free will skepticism that doesn't allow us to acknowledge wrongs. So, for example, what I call axiological judgments of right and wrong and good and bad, those remain in place, even if we reject the idea that individuals are deserving in some basic sense of punishment or blame. So the idea that even if, say, a criminal with a certain kind of neurological disorder, a brain tumor, goes on a shooting spree and kills a bunch of people, we would not attribute freedom to that individual because it was a byproduct of this tumor. Yet we could still say that what he did was bad, and what happened to those people was wrong. There's nothing preventing us from saying that, and there's nothing that requires free will for us to say that. We can still make those axiological judgments.
But we wouldn't hold him morally accountable.
Right. And so we can do the same in cases where we could say that what Hitler did was wrong. And we could say that the actions can be judged. We could have a fact-finding process, and this is what they did in South Africa, acknowledge the wrongs done. But instead of seeking retribution and payback, they decided to move forward, engage in a process of reconciliation to reconstruct and basically to do the best they could to affect things moving forward. And so I think on the geopolitical level, there's different ways one could go, and I think different circumstances have to be discussed differently. But on one level, I think that one thing we often do is spend too much time looking backward and too much time seeking blame, where what would be most beneficial would be to consider forward-looking factors like reconciliation, forward-looking safety, what would make us most safe, what would provide the best outcomes. And in an interpersonal level, you might also say moral formation. I care about you as an individual. I want to do what would be effective in shaping you as a moral being. If you think about it on the interpersonal level, like me parenting my daughter, for example, she does something wrong. Well, I could be retributive. I could resort to moral anger or backward-looking blame. Or I could ask her to reflect upon her choice, ask her to see if there was something in herself that was, the cause for that choice, and then ask her what she could do differently moving forward to make different choices. And that moral conversation, that moral exchange would be justified not on what's called desert grounds, not because she deserves it, but on what are considered forward-looking grounds, in particular, concern for moral development. I want to, as a parent, develop a moral child who makes better choices, reconciliation, and future safety, right? So those would be the justifications for these kind of moral exchanges. And you can even express sort of moral disapproval, and you could even have a kind of moral protest where you say that what that you did was wrong, and you could ask people to reflect upon the choices to see what we could do differently. But one thing I find really hard is judging people in these contexts of war and judging people in the context of conflict. And partly, again, it's because of my thoughts on luck. If you're a child born into a war-torn region, and your choices are jump on that pickup truck, grab a machine gun, and start killing this group, or join the other group and jump on that pickup truck and start killing the other, or say, I'm going to try to stay out of it, but by doing so, see your sister raped and mutilated and sold into slavery, your mother slaughtered, maybe your own hands cut off as a consequence. Would you be capable of murder in the right context? And I think that what we often forget, we tend to think of ourselves as having such moral fiber and moral strength that I wouldn't engage in certain types of acts. I could never engage in any kind of atrocities. But the sad fact, I think, is that almost anyone is capable of anything in the right circumstances. And it's by the good graces of luck, that therefore for the grace of God go I. Well, therefore, but the grace of luck go I. Yeah. That if I were unlucky enough to be thrown into those circumstances, if I were unlucky enough to be put in exactly that same situation, I myself might have engaged in exactly those same acts. I was just lucky enough not to be morally tested in that particular kind of way.
Yeah.
And no one wants to acknowledge this about themselves. But like, if you were a 16-year-old growing up in Nazi Germany, and you were socialized to have those beliefs about Jews and disabled people and gypsies and other groups, if you were socialized to have these kinds of attitudes, if you were raised in this political and economic situation, if you were put to the test of having authority figures tell you to engage in certain acts, would you have the strength to pass that test?
Yeah.
And I think the only thing we could say is we're just lucky not to have been tested in that.
That's right. Yeah.
And that unfortunate person was unlucky to have been tested in that way.
Yeah.
But that's a test. That's a moral test that is a byproduct of luck. We just don't know how we would, what we would do. And I think it's very hard for me to morally judge individuals in those kinds of contexts. That's not to say, again, that what they did was right or good or excusable, or that some people should just be let to go run free and say, okay, that was just the context of war, and so we'll wash it all clean and there's no consequences. But I do think we have to think about it differently.
Yeah. And I think
the more we learn one last thing, the more we learn from psychology, the more we learn from things like the Milgram shock experiments, where the person just says, turn it up. And most people turn it up.
Yeah.
Right? And you would say, I would never do that to an innocent person.
That's right.
Shock them to the point on the meter where it says fatal.
Yeah.
But people will do it. Because someone in a lab coat told them to do it. And the more we learn about situationalism and how context can drive individual actions, I think the more we realize that people don't have the strong moral character that we tend to think we have, that it's much more situational, and that there can be things that situationally can affect our behavior in ways that necessarily, aren't because of some deep-seated values we have, but because, some authority told us to do it, or because of peer pressure, or because the context of war or conflict. And so I think that it can affect our geopolitical policies and our attitudes if we begin to think more about the circumstances.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to wrestle with, because notwithstanding the point you made about genocide, because I come from a country where, Bosnia, where genocide, is a real thing and was a real thing. But also more recently in the Australian military, we've had some of our soldiers accused of war crimes, and there's a bunch of investigations. So I certainly don't want to question anything or even call the investigation into question. That let the courts do what they need to do. But one of the things that I'm trying to draw attention to is that, okay, things have probably happened, sure, but we have to realize the context and what led to them. And I certainly try to argue against this idea of a few bad apples that have gone and done these bad deeds. Well, I think it's broader than that. I think there's it's the circumstance, it's the bumpers that have ultimately led these things to occur. And where we start superimposing things over the top, that we know, for example, what fatigue does to our moral and ethical decision making. We know that if you don't sleep enough, that your ethical decision making will degrade. We know that if you've the peer pressure has an impact. We know that if you've seen your peers, friends die, that will impact how you make a decision. We know that if a loss of a sense of purpose will impact how you make, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are all these conditional.
Add one to that. For example, I've done a little work on white collar crime recently. We know how the culture of the unit or of the particular leadership could affect it. So, people who commit white collar crimes often is because you're in, let's say you're a financial group where greed is sort of the norm and competitiveness drives decisions. People see the opportunity for shortcuts and they take them. But if there's a culture that fosters that kind of cheating, that kind of gaming the system, people are more likely to succumb to the context of the culture. And if you create a different culture, you could get different outcomes, and you can nudge people in the right directions. So we also want to understand the causes not simply so we can forgive people or not hold them accountable, but we want to understand the condition, the causes, because we want to prevent them from happening again in the future.
Exactly.
That's one of the main reasons why we want to understand the contextual causes, not just all. Because if you think it's all about individual responsibility, then you don't need to change the culture.
That's right. We're good.
The guy failed, and his.
It's the individual's fault. Hang them out to dry.
Got the best of them. It's not anyone else's fault. It's not the culture of the bank's fault. It's not the trading. The context of trading. That's that fault. It's the individual. But if you understand that, lots of people fall into poor choices because of contextual factors, and it could be the culture of the particular business they work for, or it could be these other situational factors like fatigue and conflict. But I also want to make I want the listeners to know that doesn't mean, again, we're excusing what they do. What we're saying is that, we have to rethink our notion of desert in this sort of basic sense, because I have an example, and probably, I've never shared it really in this context before, but my father was in the Korean War. And he was, there was a book written by a colleague of his, and my father plays a big role in the book. And my father very rarely talked about war to me. And I wish now he's passed, and I wish I had talked to him more. But there's a story in the book about my father where he one day was walking down to a riverbed, to get water or wash their clothes or whatever it was. And halfway down the hill, he realized he didn't have his gun with him. And there was a woman, and every day they would have people surrendering. But what they sometimes would do, and you're probably more familiar with this than I, but they might have a grenade with a pin pulled under their arm. And when they go to raise their arm, they sacrifice themselves and blow you up. And my father, halfway down the hill, didn't know what to do. And he started picking up stones and throwing them at this woman, stoning her, and it's easy for me to judge that and be well, it's such a wrong thing to do but you got to think about the context of uncertainty. The context of the morality of conflict is different than the morality of everyday life. And it's very hard. And it's also very hard for people to realize that when people come back from conflict, that they've been in a context where morality functions differently than everyday life, and now they're told to go back to the social norms of everyday life. That's a very hard thing to transition to. And so, I can't think of what I would do in that situation, but I also can't blame him for doing what he did in that situation. And even if it turns out to be an innocent person, you don't know the epistemic uncertainty of the case. The fear that gets the best of you when you're 18 years old and you're in war and conflict. The maturity of youth in conflict. You also got to remember, these are 18, 19-year-old minds operating in life or death situations. In a context where we don't even trust these people to drink and drive or to be able to drink legally. It's such a bizarre concept that we give them guns and expect them to engage in high-level decision-making of life and death in the context of uncertainty and stress. And so this is, again, not to excuse the decision-making, but to understand that it could be a byproduct of the culture of the leadership, like what happened in Vietnam. A lot of it came from the top down. Probably a lot of what happened in Abu Ghraib and the atrocities that happened there. I mean, we hold the individual privates, accountable for what they did. But it's probably the culture of the leadership that allowed for that to happen, and they don't get held accountable.
Well, I found it interesting that Phil Zimbardo, who of course ran the Stanford Prisoner Dilemma, which very much deals with this, he was the chief expert witness, defense witness for I think the sergeant that ran the center in Abu Ghraib, because which is amazing, because he's obviously, after Stanford Prison Dilemma, he, as most of our listeners will know, that that's again a social context that drove certain behaviors. And he recognized that, if this is the recipe you've got, you can't be surprised with the product you get at the end. And realizing that the recipe you have will give you a very small, finite number of outcomes. And if you don't understand what the recipe is, then don't be surprised if you don't understand by the outcome. And I think that's kind of where my intention behind this discussion ultimately is to land exactly on this point, that circumstances will dictate behavior ultimately beyond the control of the individual. And whilst it's comforting,
I don't think people realize how extensive that is. So in my first book, I spent a lot of time on literature and social psychology. I have to acknowledge some of it has been thrown into doubt with this crisis of replication. And so some of the findings are now not as clear as they used to be. But there is at least a wealth of information on how situational factors can influence choices. So some really startling ones, like, for example, when you go to a liquor store, they find that if you're playing classical music, people will spend 10% more on a bottle of wine than if you're playing top 40. Now, the amazing thing about this kind of situational effects is that, when people ask, do you think the music had an impact on your purchase? They deny it. So not only are they not aware of the situational effect on their choice, they deny that there was any situational effect on their choice. And yet we could see over and over again how easy it is for these factors to influence our choices. And so I laughed about the color of the wall, but we know that, for example, colors of the wall can influence mood. And so I can almost guarantee you that if you go to any psych ward in the country, you're not going to find the walls painted fire engine red.
Yeah.
And that's because they're painted soothing, calming colors. And so are schools, because they know certain colors could have certain effects on one's emotional states, and those emotional states could affect behavior. There's a number of really rich examples of how these situational factors, like there's an example that goes back, it's, I think, sort of the birth of this literature, when they had payphones around cities. And so they placed a dime in the return. So a lot of people check the return to see if there's any cash in there before they make a phone call. And then they had someone, an actor essentially, walk by and drop papers. And the effects couldn't be any greater. What they found was 90% of the people who found a dime in the return stopped and helped the person. Only 10% of the people who did not find a dime stopped and helped. Now, if you ask the person, why did you help or why did you not help? You're going to say something about your own moral character, or you're going to say, the person was in need and so I helped them. And you might think, well, I'm the kind of person that would help someone in need. But what these findings show is it's not really about character. It's about circumstances. And so the general explanation is that finding a dime, even though it's kind of inconsequential, puts one in a good mood. And when one's in a good mood, they're more likely to help others.
The power of framing, right? Like Robert Cialdini in Persuasion. There
are thousands of these kinds of findings that show us how very small, crazy, inconsequential things can nudge us in various directions to make various decisions. And it's amazing that we know this when we think about consumerism and when we think about advertising. People spend millions of dollars in picking the logos and the colors and paying for placement on various shelves. We know if a product is placed at eye level, it's more likely to be purchased than if it's at the higher level or lower level.
Well, look at social media now. These algorithms know us better than we know ourselves. And we know this. We know this to be true, that, I need shoes because, 6 months ago I bought a pair of shoes and the algorithms were calculated that, knowing how much I've tracked my running, et cetera, it's going to be time for new shoes. And all of a sudden the ad pops up on my Facebook, et cetera. I mean, these algorithms know us better than we know ourselves. We know this to be true, but we reject, still we deny how programmable we truly are, which I find absolutely fascinating. I can't let you go without, and also firstly, I just want to acknowledge the fact that you're spot on. When I talked about genocides and war crimes and so on, this is by no means to suggest that they are excusable in the sense that they're okay. They are absolutely wrong, but I think we need to invest the time to understand what has led to these things as opposed to merely blaming the individuals. But I just want to touch on your quarantining model, because that's a critical question, because if we do accept free will skepticism, or if we deny that free will exists, I think one of the inevitable responses, certainly that I experience with most people, so what, you just let every criminal, do what they want, and, what's going to stop me from, now, becoming a murderer, etc. How do we deal with crime, if we on a kind of societal level, accept that, well, hold on, conditions do create behavior, and therefore we can't just blame the individual as we have in the traditional sense.
Yeah, so I've been working, my book, Rejecting Retributivism, it's called Free Will, Punishment, and Criminal Justice, is my attempt to spell out this account in its fullest form. But I've been developing it for a number of years, and it builds off of work done by Dirk Purenboom as well. It's called the public health quarantine model, and it has the public health part and the quarantine part. So the quarantine part is pretty straightforward. The idea is something like this. Well, free will skepticism is true, then no one is morally responsible in this basic desert sense. And so therefore criminals wouldn't be morally responsible in this basic desert sense. But neither are people with communicable diseases. So let's say I travel to Australia to have a drink with you in person or something, and along the way I contract Ebola. And so I test positive when I arrive in Australia. I think that everyone would agree that the state would be justified in quarantining me and limiting my liberty. And it has nothing to do with the fact that I have free will or morally responsible for having contracted the Ebola. Retribution and punishment doesn't even seem fitting in this context. But the justification for limiting the liberty and quarantining the individual would be the right of self-defense and prevention of harm to others, i.e. we would, just like we all now know with current COVID situation, we could justify restricting liberty and quarantining individuals on the grounds of public health and safety.
Yeah.
So the argument for the analogy would be that we could develop an incapacitation account for seriously dangerous criminals. So when you have a serial killer or child molester or a repeat violent offender, we could justify incapacitating them, meaning holding them, restricting their liberty, on the grounds of the right of self-defense and prevention of harm to others, analogous to the justification we have for quarantining people with communicable diseases. So we could say that the serial killer needs to be incapacitated because they pose a forward-looking threat to society. And we could restrict their liberty to protect public health and safety. And the justification is the right of self-defense. And you could do that without appealing to free will or assuming moral responsibility or retribution or payback or giving them their just deserts. But I want to make a couple of things clear. When you do that, a number of really important reforms follow and are really important for how we would implement this in the criminal justice system. For one, not only do I view it as non-retributive, I view it as non-punitive, meaning not really punishment at all, an alternative to punishment. You don't punish the Ebola patient, but by no intuitive definition is it punishment, yet you are restricting their liberty.
Yeah.
And so what I would argue is we're justified in restricting the liberty of these individuals, but we're not justified in dehumanizing them or disenfranchising them or stripping them of all their other basic rights. So for me, you could justify quarantining me at the airport because I have Ebola, but you can't justify taking away my voting rights or telling me I can't apply for public housing. And so all of those disenfranchisement and all those issues that we see, like voter disenfranchisement, housing disenfranchisement, associated with the criminal justice system, especially in the United States. The other thing would be when you quarantine the individual, that the story doesn't end there. You have a moral duty to treat that Ebola patient and then release them the minute they're no longer communicable, that they could spread the disease. And so what I would argue is that the criminal justice system would have to reorient itself to rehabilitation and reintegration. The goal should be to rehabilitate and reintegrate people as quickly as possible, and that you lack any justification for continuing to hold them the minute they're no longer a threat. And so it's not about giving them their just deserts for what they've done. It's about protecting society. And the right of self-defense allows me to limit their freedom, but only to the extent that is necessary. So I embrace what I call the principle of least infringement. You have to adopt the least restrictive measure possible, consistent with protecting public health and safety, which means many of the things we currently incarcerate people for, we better dealt with by alternatives to incarceration. Like if I sneeze on you and you get sick, I've caused you some harm. But we don't quarantine people for the common cold. We restrict quarantine to very rare, very extreme, very precise, limited cases. And so I would say the same thing for incapacitation. we shouldn't use it as a default for all criminal wrongdoing. It should be restricted to, only very extreme sorts of violent crimes. And so when you look at the statistics, going back to what I suggested earlier, this is at least true in the United States, and it's true in lots of places like Australia and England. The vast majority of people in the United States that are imprisoned have a diagnosable mental illness, over 50%. I think some studies put it at about 64% of jail patients have a mental illness. It's much higher among women. 75% of women incarcerated have a diagnosable mental illness.
Wow.
Many of them would be better dealt with by mental health services. That our jails have become de facto mental health institutions, which they're not suited for. Many people incarcerated in the United States are incarcerated for low-level drug possession or underlying addiction problems that cause them to commit other criminal acts. Well, many of them would be better dealt with by drug treatment.
Yeah.
And my model is also consistent with the decriminalization of many things we currently incarcerate people for. So the legalization of marijuana, for example. And so we have to reevaluate why we incarcerate people for, how long we incarcerate people for, and whether the kind of offenses that we incarcerate them for really reach the level of threat to public safety that deemed that we really should. And in many cases, you'll see that better alternatives exist. The public, let me just say very quickly, just the public health part, which I think is the really innovative part, is to reorient the focus to prevention and social justice. So we already have a well-established public health framework for addressing health outcomes. And so when you look at, like, say, infant mortality rates around the world, you might say, let's look at India and why are children dying in childbirth at higher rates? And so what you'll often find is that these poor health outcomes are the byproducts of underlying social injustices. In this case, largely sexism. Women don't have reproductive control over their bodies. They don't have access to birth control. They often have no say in how many children they have. And they often lack literacy, so they can't leave their husbands if they want to, or work for themselves. And so if you address the underlying inequalities, often infant mortality rates equal out, they drop. And so what you often find is, like, type 2 diabetes. Well, that's higher in poorer Black and brown communities, and heart disease. And it's often due to structural injustices, like they don't have access to persistent, consistent health care. If you had universal health care or access to health care or preventative care, these poor health outcomes go away or equalize. And so what we want to do then is, if you see violent or criminal behavior as a byproduct of social determinants, the public health framework says that what we should do is identify the social determinants, prioritize them, and then figure out best practices for how to address them and how to address the social underlying structures that cause the behavior in the first place. And so what I want to do in my work is sort of move us away from the reactive approach, where we simply react to crime with punitive measures, to a preventative approach, where we see individuals holistically as embedded in social systems and adopt practices and policies that are aimed at prevention and addressing racism, sexism, structural inequality, educational inequity, unequal access to healthcare, homelessness. And what you'll figure out is that this is going to produce better outcomes. It's more effective than punishment, traditional punishment, and it keeps us safer, and it's better for all of society. And you have a self-interest in it, because in the end, you're better protected, you're less susceptible to violence. It's a win-win, and it's more humane. And so I tend to see this. So I owe you a story, right? I'm a free will skeptic. What do I do with the serial killer? Well, I could justify incapacitating them. But I also want to acknowledge that, there will be dangerous people, and there will be a need for quarantine and incapacitation for the foreseeable future. But that's not to say that we should view everyone as responsible and therefore give them their just desserts. We need to incapacitate them for our safety. But on the other hand, we also need to fix the circumstances and change them so that other people don't end up in the same place.
Yeah, that's right. And again, change the guardrails that we have enough evidence to support this. This is not. Recently, me and my partner lived in Sweden for 3 years.
Oh yeah. The Scandinavian countries.
I mean, it is just it is a different relationship between the citizen to the state and the state to the citizen, and how you're viewed, and the guardrails that exist to allow you, not necessarily equal outcomes, but equal opportunity. In the at least from what I could see, most well-meaning way. Right? It's not utopia, and there isn't utopia, but it certainly has many characters that I would like to see in the Australian society as well. The way the state is viewed and the way the state views the citizen, I think is vastly different to what we used to. And also it's far more empathetic. And I think this is what you're suggesting, as well as the idea of free will skepticism. It would immediately make us more empathetic to others, to other people's suffering, as opposed to allowing us, as it does now, to get on our high horse and say, well, it's their own fault.
Yeah, especially when you realize, given the wealth of data, that crime is more a byproduct of circumstances than the people.
Yeah.
In that, again, the lives of the individuals if you go into a prison and you look at the lives of those people who are incarcerated, they're filled with hardship and abuse and injustice.
Yeah.
And there's, also we just have this idea that, would you want to be judged by your worst act? And what we do is we take the worst deed that someone has done, and we tag them with that. We label them like a scarlet letter for the rest of their lives, which basically excludes the possibility of redemption and excludes the possibility of rehabilitation. It tags you as a criminal or a felon, and therefore you're a felon for life.
Yeah.
So it's, again, not to forgive people or to just excuse people, but to say, we know that there are byproducts that drive these kind of things. We want to change those. We also want to rehabilitate people, both for their well-being and for my well-being. We all have a stake. And you mentioned the Scandinavian countries. They they're not fully there, but they're close to there, in that they have a system that is focused on rehabilitation and reintegration, far less punitive, far less retributive, and they understand the investment part of it. So, for example, and by the way, they get better outcomes. Yeah,
less recidivism, right? I mean, far lower rates of reincarnation.
So if you think about the United States makes up only about 4.5% of the world's population. It's a really small segment of the world overall population, but we house 25% of the world's prisoners. That is the highest rate of incarceration known to any civilization. We incarcerate 700 people for every 100,000 people. Norway, Denmark, Sweden, they're about 60 people for every 100,000. Australia is 170 for every 100,000. We're literally incarcerating 10 times as many people. So 1 out of every 31 Americans, 1 out of 31 is somewhere in the criminal justice system.
That is just
parole, probation, prison, bonkers. Jail, somewhere in that net. 1 out of 31.
Wow, it's
a highly criminalized society. And we have poor outcomes. We have one of the worst rates of recidivism, which is repeat crime. It's nearly 76% of prisoners will be rearrested within the first 5 years of release. Norway and countries like that, they have one of the lowest rates of recidivism, somewhere around 20%. And they incarcerate such a smaller population and for a much shorter period of time. 90% of people that are sentenced in Norway will serve less than a year. So only about 10% of people serve more than a year, whereas the vast majority of people in the United States are serving lengthy sentences. And many are serving either life sentences or virtual life sentences, meaning they're going to die aging out in their sentence. And we're not better off for this.
And I think that's the key point.
One of the reasons is we take a punitive approach. We take the person, we strip them naked when they arrive, we cage them, we house them in inhumane environments, we control every aspect of their lives, when they eat, when they wake up, we deny them educational opportunity and work training, and then we release them and expect them to be model citizens. Well, it just intuitively doesn't make any sense.
That's right.
What we find is that prison educational programs alone reduce recidivism by 40%.
Yeah,
that's
amazing.
Money.
That's amazing.
For every dollar we spend, it saves us $5.
Wow, that in itself, that figure alone, 40% reduction purely through education. I mean, that in itself should, you know, and I'm sure the research is sound and repeatable, etc. That should drive policy, but you know, it doesn't, because it's like crazy. You said earlier, people have this strong individualistic streak, right.
and they have, you know, they have beliefs. They'd say like, well, I can't even afford to send my kid to college. Why should taxpayers pay to send prisoners to college? Well, part of the reason is it's in your self-interest. And the other part of it is it actually saves your taxpayer dollars. Yeah. Because if you don't, every dollar we spend, it saves us $5. Because the property damage that creates a cost to society, the legal fees, the court fees, the fees that it costs to house individuals in prison, all of us are paying that. Yeah. And we're paying more than if we were to simply provide them with training and opportunity and give them the skills necessary to succeed.
The short-term kind of vision of, well, it's going to, you know, and like you said, I think you're spot on. You know, why would I pay for, you know, criminals to get education when my children can't? I think that's again, it comes down to this idea of, you know, well, in our capitalist societies of individualism and meritocracy, you know, everybody gets their just desserts, right? Yeah. Whatever they've earned. Gregg, I'm blown away. I knew I would enjoy this conversation, but I've enjoyed it far more than I thought I would. Thank you so much. I know we've touched on many different subjects, but is there anything that you find is important that we haven't touched on that springs to mind?
There's so much more, but I think this is a good place to leave it. But I've really enjoyed our conversation, and it's great that people are, and yourself included, are seeing connections even beyond the areas that I've worked in. And so thank you to the work that you do as well.
Absolutely. No, I'm absolutely fascinated and looking forward to getting your most recent book in the mail in the coming days that I look forward to reading. But thank you very much for your time. I know it was exceptionally early for you. I can see the sun slowly coming out behind you. So I hope you have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for your time once again.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Voices of War. You can access all episodes on www.thevoicesofwar.com or by subscribing wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And while you're there, please give us a review, as we'd love to hear what you think. If you'd like to recommend a guest for the show, you can reach me on info@thevoicesofwar.com.